You're watching CGTV, Community Government Television, Channel 11, Pitkin County, City of Aspen, and Town of Snowmass Village.
The City of Aspen, established in 1881, has over 220 full-time employees, a number that swells to more than 425 with the addition of seasonal and temporary workers. Organized into more than 20 departments, the City of Aspen provides major amenities like parks, a rec center, and open space, and services like utilities and police and Kids First to its residents and visitors. From the golf course to the Community Development Department, the Wheeler Opera House to the Parking Department, the City of Aspen and its employees strive to do the best job possible. A major goal of the city is keeping open communication between the government and the citizens. Welcome to City Matters, a show where the city does matter, and matters of the city are brought to you. Hello and welcome to City Matters. I'm Mitzi Rapkin, Director of Community Relations for the City of Aspen, and I am so honored today to be joined by Natalie Tsevdos. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks for having me.
And Natalie is our local health inspector. She takes care of all of the restaurants in Aspen, and she also knows a lot about foodborne illnesses and hand washing, and we're going to talk about all of that today. So first, tell me a little bit about your background and how did you get to the City of Aspen?
Well, I started out, my childhood dream was to be a veterinarian. So I studied the sciences, biology, microbiology, and I found it really interesting. But I became more interested in health on a community level rather than an individual level. And so I learned about public health as an undergraduate at Ohio State, and decided to attend Colorado State University in Fort Collins, which is what brought me to Colorado initially. And I studied public health there and just became really interested in food safety. And so that's how I became a health inspector.
Awesome. And right now it's almost September and you've been with the city for 6 months.
Correct, yeah. So I'm still relatively new with the city, but I've been doing this work for a few years now.
Is there anything you noticed right away when you came to the city that was just kind of like something that maybe surprised you or that you hadn't noticed on other jobs or something that was just interesting?
I feel like Aspen as a community is kind of more of a trendsetter. So, and the food industry is really always changing. There's always new processes and new foods that people are interested in. So I definitely noticed right away that there's a really high caliber chefs here, and they're really educated and they're really interested in kind of pushing the envelope and trying new foods and new processes. So it's been fun to kind of learn about that stuff as I go.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you must see some interesting concoctions and food as art and combinations, and because you just pop in.
Yeah, definitely. The chef, for them, food safety is obviously really important to them, but for them it's really about the creative process and flavors and, you know, competing with other restaurants and just trying to have, you know, the next big thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe this gets into some of that, but what do you love the most about what you do?
Well, that does tie into what I love about my job. It's definitely never boring. I can't say that. There's always something new to learn. I'm always meeting new people because I'm not just sitting in an office. You know, I'm going out and I'm meeting with people and learning about their history and the way that they're running their restaurant. So it's really a treat to kind of get to go out in the community and meet different people. They're also, all of the chefs and food workers are, you know, really passionate about what they do, and they're really, really a good, hardworking group of people. So it's nice to get to interact with them and help make their business successful.
So what do you think people might not know about what you do? I mean, there's a lot that people might not know, but, you know, in general, when you say you're a restaurant inspector, you really face to face with the restaurant owners, but not the broader community.
Yeah. I think one of the most common misconceptions about this job, I think people have a really antiquated view of what a health inspector does, and I think they see us as the bad guy, and that we're giving the restaurants a hard time, and we're shutting them down left and right, and that's really not what this job is. Our focus and my approach is really educational and compliance assistance, so enforcement is a last resort. That's not, we're not kicking in the back door and coming in and just giving them a hard time. And I think that's kind of a misconception that people have. Mm-hmm. And then another thing, this is just something that comes up for me a lot. A common misconception with the public is I always hear people talk about how they have the stomach flu. And the stomach flu is not a thing. So flu is a respiratory illness. And if you have anything stomach related or digestive issues, there's a good chance that you probably have a foodborne illness, but that's not something that is caused by the flu.
All right, good to know.
Yeah.
So how many restaurants in Aspen do you oversee?
So it kind of fluctuates because there's always places closing and then new places opening back up. But in general, there's about 115 to 120 food permits, active food permits in the city at any given time. And I think it's important to note that while that's mostly restaurants, it's not all full service restaurants. So anyone that serves food to the public needs a license. So that includes caterers, that includes grocery stores, convenience stores, carts, kiosks, things like that. So it is mostly restaurants, but there's a lot of other facilities included in that number that people might not realize.
So it could be like a commercial kitchen if you're making chocolate bars.
Yes, a lot of those aren't licensed by me unless they're serving the public, direct to consumer.
Okay.
So there's other departments and also the FDA that oversees what we call manufactured foods. What I oversee is retail food, so retail direct to consumer. Manufactured foods are things that you would see on a grocery store shelf. Packaged foods.
So if you were making a chocolate bar, but you were selling it at the farmer's market?
Then that would be both retail and manufacturing.
Okay. So can you walk us through of what it entails when you go to a restaurant?
Yeah. So the restaurant inspections that we do are unannounced, so they have no idea that we're coming. We try to go at a time when they're not incredibly busy because you really want to be able to talk to the employees, talk to the manager, and ask them questions. That's a huge part of the inspection, is getting an idea of their operations and their policies and procedures and just assessing their knowledge. So we try to go when they're not too busy. So it's not a great thing to walk in at 12:15.
Yeah.
But we also want to see them actually making food. So the things that I look for first are what we call dynamic processes. So if they're cooking food, cooling food, standing on the line and watching the employees, watching them, making sure that they're washing their hands when they're supposed to and that they're washing their hands correctly. Because those are really the things that we want to assess. Temperatures are very important as well, but that's probably going to be the same at the beginning of the inspection as it is at the end of the inspection. So it's not necessarily the first place I go. That, I think, is another misconception, that people think that, we go in there with our thermometer and we just start checking food, and again, that's a big part of it, but that's not necessarily the first thing that we go to or the most important thing.
And so once you're kind of looking at that, do you have a score sheet or some kind of pass-fail system, or what are all the process? You mentioned the dynamic processes, but how do you then kind of come up with a conclusion?
Yeah, so we have a state inspection form that everybody in the state uses, which is really good for consistency, and it also helps with compliance. Our violations, we call them, so if we observe a violation, we try as hard as possible to correct it on site during the inspection if we can. If we, for whatever reason, can't do that, maybe it's a plumbing issue and they need to get somebody in there to repair it, then we'll do a follow-up inspection. But we have different, so the violations are kind of categorized by severity. So we have what we call foodborne illness risk factors. So those are things that, if they're out of compliance, could directly lead to somebody becoming sick. So an example of that would be if they were undercooking a burger that's going to be served to a child. We would obviously correct that on site immediately. That's obviously a foodborne illness risk factor. That's very serious. And then we have what we call non-critical violations, and those are things that aren't necessarily going to directly lead to somebody becoming sick, but we still want them to take care of it. And those things can probably wait for a follow-up. An example would be a screen that is broken. So it's an issue because a mouse or bugs could get in, but it doesn't need to be fixed right this minute.
Right. So like you mentioned, a burger that might be undercooked. Does that mean you can just kind of take that burger and temperature set it, or?
Yeah. So we do take temperatures throughout the inspection. And we also ask a lot of questions about that, so that would definitely be a question that I would ask. I would also look at the menu and make sure that that a undercooked burger isn't an option for a child. There are options for on the adult menu or normal menu that people can have undercooked meats. Obviously, some people like to have their eggs over easy. People like rare steaks, and that's totally fine, as long as they have the consumer advisory on the menu. So that little statement that you've probably seen on a lot of menus that says consuming raw or undercooked meats may increase your chance of illness. So that's why that's on there, to notify the customer of their risk of ordering something like that.
Is there anything that different, like I just think about sushi and like raw fish and how much people love that. Is that inspection system different when you're dealing with raw food that is meant to be raw, that's served raw? Is there anything different about that?
So when it comes to sushi and raw fish, source becomes a big conversation. So most restaurants are buying sushi grade is not really a scientific term, but that's kind of what it's called in the industry. So they're buying sushi grade fish that has been treated for parasites, and so that's safe to be consumed raw. Mm-hmm. So source is a big thing that we look at with that.
And you mentioned that you have a form, so you don't grade.
We don't have grades or scores. We also don't have point values. So really it's kind of based off of the inspector. So it's kind of based off of my judgment whether or not I feel like I need to do a follow-up. And again, my approach is to kind of look at the facility as a whole and, you know, see, okay, does the manager, do they know what they're talking about? Are they training employees? Every restaurant is going to have something. You know, I can always find something. There's always something that they need to work on. But do they have risk factors all over the place that is just completely out of control? Or, you know, is it just a little thing here and there that they need to work on? So that kind of determines the, you know, the good from the bad.
Have you ever found a correlation, I'm not just talking about Aspen, but like in your career between the price point on the menu and the cleanliness of the kitchen?
You would think, but no. I always, you know, again, we don't do grades, but I feel like every town or place that I've worked, they're different in that there's different trends, but they're also the same in that there's always a handful of people that are just rock stars. They're crushing it. I feel like I don't even need to be there. They could tell me what to do, you know, and then there's the handful that definitely need a lot of work. They're struggling, employee turnover and employee training and things like that. And then most people kind of fall somewhere in the middle where they're not perfect, but they have one or two things that they need to work on.
Is there anything that consumers should know about the restaurant inspection program from that end?
Yeah, I think one thing that, you know, I do want consumers to know is that if they do see something that's concerning, if they, you know, see somebody not wash their hands when they come out of the bathroom, things like that, obviously if they feel like they got sick at a restaurant, I definitely want them to call us and report that, because that's how we can go in, double check, make sure that everything is under control, and prevent other people from getting sick or getting harmed. And so that's kind of our ultimate goal with consumers reporting concerns and complaints to us.
And you don't only do restaurants, as you mentioned, you do other food services. Maybe they're making burritos and selling them later. But also, what about special events? We have food and wine here. We have a lot of things that involve food.
Yeah, so anybody that is going to be serving food to the public has to go through some sort of approval process. So when it comes to special events, we do have a application process that they need to go through to be able to serve food to the public. And that includes food trucks. So most of them come from outside of the city, because we don't really have food trucks here in the city. So most of them are coming from other counties or even other states, and they definitely have to get approved before they can come operate here. And then we also have what we call tent and table vendors. So those are the type of vendors that you would see at like a farmer's market, for example. And it's all the same. They have to follow all the same rules. The temperatures don't change. Listeria doesn't know that you're outside. You still have to wash your hands because you're outside. So it's a lot of the same rules. It's just a different setting.
Right. And so what are the, you're mentioning some of these foodborne illnesses. What are people at risk for? You were saying earlier it's not the flu. Can you clarify some of that?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different germs or pathogens that cause foodborne illness that we know of. There's over 30 that have been identified. So Listeria, Salmonella, those are things that I think most people have heard of in the news, either with a recall or with an outbreak. So there's bacteria like that, and then there's also viruses. So Norovirus is actually the most common cause of foodborne illness, and it's an absolutely miserable disease if you've ever had it. That is usually the cause of cruise ships returning early, if you've seen those stories in the news. So it's just super contagious. It's also really common in schools. And that is definitely an employee health and hygiene issue. And so that's another good thing for the public to know, is that if you're sick, you really shouldn't be preparing food for other people, because with things like that, it's really easy to transfer that to your family members or other people that you're cooking food for.
Have you ever had norovirus?
I've never been diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure I've had it. The symptoms are it's very, very prolific. Vomiting is like the Hallmark symptom. So like I said, it's just really miserable, and it really knocks you out.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah.
So, some of this stuff can transfer to what people do at home, how they're safe with their food at home. So what sort of tips do you have?
Yeah. I think the most important thing, no matter where you are, if you're a restaurant or if you're a consumer, is hand washing. And I know it sounds simple, but it's not just important for foodborne illness prevention, but a lot of diseases. A lot of diseases are transferred by touch, by our hands, from us touching objects and then contaminating them. So hand washing is really the most important thing that people can do to protect themselves and their loved ones from getting sick.
What about, you just cook something and you're going to freeze it?
Yeah, so temperatures are also important. I always recommend cooking foods all the way through. Leftovers with things like that, you want to make sure that you get it into the refrigerator as soon as possible. So not leaving things sitting out. And then also making sure that your refrigerator is actually working. So the danger zone, I don't know if that's something that people are familiar with, but the danger zone where bacteria will grow is between 40 degrees and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So your refrigerator should be below 40 degrees to make sure that food is being kept cold.
And there's if you take something off the boiler, you don't have to wait. You make chili. You don't have to wait for it to cool to a certain degree to put it in the fridge or freezer?
I would recommend letting it sit out for a little bit, because if you put it in your refrigerator, it might make other food warm. And it's probably above 145 when it's finished cooking, or above 140 when it's finished cooking. So it doesn't need to be put in right away, but I'm thinking more like picnics or events and things like that where food is sitting out for multiple hours, and that's definitely something to avoid.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about how I treat my food.
Yeah. The only way to really know for sure is to use a thermometer. I think a lot of us are just used to doing things how we do them, or how maybe our mom or our grandmother taught us how to do it. And, not that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but you really don't know unless you actually take a temperature.
And most people probably do not do that.
Probably not.
Not when they cook their
I'm
meat.
even guilty of not doing that so much.
Yeah.
Definitely at Thanksgiving when I'm cooking a turkey or something that I don't cook a lot and I'm not sure. But for other things that I feel like, I know how long it's gonna, I know how long it takes. I don't always check the temperature of my food.
Yeah, but that would be another thing at home is you undercook. You're like, I want it, I want a rare burger.
Yeah.
Well, how rare is rare?
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, in some levels, it's a judgment call or a risk.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, when it comes to children or other highly susceptible populations, so young children under 5 or elderly people that don't have as good of an immune system as a healthy adult, things like E. coli are a big concern, because that can lead where you and I might just be miserable for a couple days and recover on our own. They might end up in the hospital with really serious complications. So for people like that, it's really important to, just cook food all the way through.
And what you mentioned, you want people to call if they get sick at a restaurant. I mean, it would be obvious if you were throwing up. You could usually trace it back to something you ate, maybe not an hour before, but maybe the day before. So what is the timelines for that, and what other symptoms should people look for if they think it's food they got served?
Yeah. So the hallmark symptoms of foodborne illness, it's going to depend on the bacteria or the virus, but vomiting and diarrhea are the two big symptoms. A sore throat with fever. Jaundice is a sign of hepatitis A, and that is transmitted through food. Some of these symptoms, there can be other causes as well, but those are the main symptoms of foodborne illness, and also just, stomach cramps and fever could be present. It might not necessarily be present, but usually when we're talking about foodborne illness, we're talking about the GI system, so vomiting and diarrhea.
And are you kind of like a 24-hour, if you ate it an hour ago, if you ate something, if you're sick, but you're telling me about the burrito you ate an hour ago, it's probably not that.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So people instinctively target the last thing that they ate. It's almost always not the case. So when people do call us, we collect what is called a 72-hour food history, and we try to gather information about everything that they've eaten over the past 3 days, because, again, depending on the pathogen, it's probably not the last thing you ate. In general, norovirus takes... The symptoms will appear within a few hours and maybe last a day. When it's a bacterial infection, those take several days to develop. So with something like salmonella, for example, it's very unlikely that it's the last thing you ate, or even something you ate within the last day.
And a lot of times those have really similar symptoms, so you might just get through the sickness, but you never really know what you had.
Exactly, and that makes it really challenging. Like I mentioned, most healthy adults recover on their own, which is good, but that means that they don't go to the doctor and they don't get a diagnosis. So it's really hard to go into a restaurant when you're not even sure if they got sick there, and you're also not sure what illness they have, because, for example, if they get diagnosed with E. coli, I know generally what foods I'm going to be looking for, or what practices I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at employee hygiene, I'm going to be looking at source for beef, I'm going to be looking at, are they washing their produce? So it really helps to have a diagnosis, because then you can do a targeted inspection and really hone in on, what could be the cause or what can we do to prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. And you were talking earlier about like the single biggest thing that anyone can do is hand washing.
Yeah.
Are there any rules about hand washing?
Yeah. So a really important thing about hand washing is that just good old-fashioned hand washing with warm running water and soap for 20 seconds is the most effective thing. Hand sanitizers are not a good substitute for hand washing because the mechanical action of you actually moving your hands and rubbing them together is what loosens a lot of the dirt and bacteria. So hand sanitizers are fine if you're, out in the backcountry, you have no other option, but it's not a good substitute for hand washing. And none of the hand sanitizers that I know of are effective against norovirus, which I mentioned is one of the biggest cause of illness. So they're not going to be effective against that.
And are you in a camp, and are restaurant inspectors at all in a camp about antibacterial soap or regular soap?
I'm not. I think either one. Regular soap, again, is just fine because it's really the movement of your hands and the action of the water that is what's going to make them clean.
Yeah. Any other sort of last tips or things people should think about or you want them to know?
I think one thing, this is just another misconception that I get from people, is that, when it comes to food safety, it's a lot about hand hygiene, and it's a lot about practices like preventing cross-contamination. Cleanliness is obviously very important, but that is not the most important thing. So we do get, a fair amount of concerns related to, restaurants being dirty. That's obviously something that we follow up with, and it's not acceptable, but it's not the most important thing. So the most important thing really comes down to health and hygiene of the person preparing the food.
All right. So I'm sure when you come in the door, like when you first came to the job, did you go around to introduce yourself first, or did you just come and say, I'm here?
Yeah, I just show up and I say, I'm your new inspector, and, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, imagine somebody coming into your job unannounced, and it's like, I'm going to
look at everything you do,
criticize everything you do and tell you what you're doing wrong. They're very welcoming, and they see the importance in it. And again, it's not, I shouldn't have used the word criticize, because it's not that we're criticizing them. It's really more of, we're all on the same team. We're all on the same page. We don't want customers getting sick. And so they're pretty welcoming and open to what I have to say.
Great. So if anyone in the public wants to find you, you are in the old powerhouse.
Correct.
With the EH team on the second floor, and your email is?
Natalie, Natalie, .Tsevdos, which is spelled Tsevdos, at cityofaspen.com.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing all this with me.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for watching.
You're watching CGTV, Community Government Television, Channel 11, Pitkin County, City of Aspen, and Town of Snowmass Village.
The City of Aspen, established in 1881, has over 220 full-time employees, a number that swells to more than 425 with the addition of seasonal and temporary workers. Organized into more than 20 departments, the City of Aspen provides major amenities like parks, a rec center, and open space, and services like utilities and police and Kids First to its residents and visitors. From the golf course to the Community Development Department, the Wheeler Opera House to the Parking Department, the City of Aspen and its employees strive to do the best job possible. A major goal of the city is keeping open communication between the government and the citizens. Welcome to City Matters, a show where the city does matter, and matters of the city are brought to you.